In the heart of the Caribbean, where a carefree attitude to life abounds and coconuts rest on white sandy beaches, lies what might be the single worst city in the world right now. Besieged on all sides, Haiti's capital is crumbling. The international community has watched on as the nation's most important metropolis has struggled and clawed its way through crises so severe that they nearly proved crippling. We want to share a story of redemption, a tale of a people fighting to reclaim their capital and rebuild their nation. Yet we find ourselves unable to fully convey it. In truth, many of the nation's persistent problems have their origins right here, leaving people destitute, fearful, starving, even dead. If you imagine its history over the past 2 centuries, you'll notice that it has rarely enjoyed a reprieve, let alone a golden age. For more than 200 years, the people of Port-au-Prince have struggled without respite. So what exactly is this intricate network of issues woven into the very fabric of this city's stories? How has life become even more difficult than in the past? And is there any chance of improvement? Well, let's find out, because this is Port-au-Prince, though living here hardly feels like royalty. Now, Port-au-Prince's story begins with the Spanish and the French, as colonists from the Old World set foot on fresh, fertile lands that promised great fortune. However, that wealth was not achieved through their own hard work. It was built on the backs of victims of the notoriously brutal international slave trade. Africans, forcibly removed from their homes, were trafficked all the way across the Atlantic to labor on sugar plantations, which was a violent and dangerous reality. Haiti, or as it was known back then, Saint-Domingue, eventually emerged as the crown jewel of the French Empire by the late 18th century. It was also the most profitable location for growing sugarcane in all of the Americas, ushering in a depraved and twisted system of violence and forced labor that left many mutilated, traumatized, displaced, and of course dead. But it wouldn't remain so. Inspired by the stories of their French masters rising up against the ruling class back home, Toussaint Louverture led a slave revolt that culminated in a full-blown revolution in 1791. As Napoleon stormed across Europe in the early 1800s, so much was happening on the continent that no one could intervene, leading to the emergence of the Republic of Haiti in 1804, an independent nation made up of mostly formerly enslaved black individuals. It was the first of its kind. However, Cap Français, now known as Cap Haitian, would no longer serve as the capital of this new nation. The free men chose a new seat of power, Port-au-Prince. While the old capital lay in the north, Port-au-Prince is nestled on the west coast further south along the dazzling waters of Port-au-Prince Bay. Fast forward to modern day, and this city remains the capital over 200 years later. That burgeoning slave colony, which once revolted against its French masters, has transformed into a modern nation, while the capital has blossomed into the country's most important city. As of 2015, the city's population stood at no less than 1.2 million, with the metro area reaching 3 million, meaning a significant portion of the nation's residents live in or near the capital. Situated in the heart of the Caribbean, with its hot weather, turquoise waters, and white sands, many might consider this place to be paradise. But don't be fooled. This city, much like the country as a whole, is suffering in myriad ways. While neighboring countries like Jamaica, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic fare relatively well by comparison, Haiti and its capital remain on their knees. So, what are the many issues plaguing this city, and how throughout history has such a beautiful place become the source of so much bloodshed? There is a massive swath of issues overwhelming the Haitian capital today, too many to list exhaustively. However, when examining Port-au-Prince's most pressing problems, the most significant is undoubtedly the senseless violence on the streets. This violence is fueled by rampant gangs that the police and military have been unable to control. In many ways, the problems of Port-au-Prince reflect those of Haiti as a whole. As the central hub for government, law and order, the economy, disorder in the capital inevitably spreads chaos throughout the country. And this holds true for the violence as well. Extreme violence in the capital has cascaded into extreme violence elsewhere. Meanwhile, as resources are thrown into the wood chipper to combat these issues, other regions of the country are left with progressively fewer means to survive, and thus the cycle repeats. And in a way, violence has almost always divided Port-au-Prince. It was made the capital after a revolution after all. For a while, even though it was poor, and we'll get into why that was later, the violence remained relatively contained until it escalated sharply when Papa Doc came to power. Real name Francois Duvalier. Unlike most violent dictators, he came to power through an election, although that process was criticized for the tactics he used and was generally not regarded as free or fair. However, Papa Doc soon received a rude awakening in the lessons of statehood. After surviving a coup the following year, the proverbial hammer came down, and nowhere was its impact felt more than in the capital. Papa Doc massively centralized the nation around Port-au-Prince, funneling nearly all resources into urban areas and especially the capital, while ignoring the needs of the rural population. His dictatorship was marked by brutal repression, extreme violence, and an unwavering iron grip on the capital. Institutions were weakened deliberately, the army was co-opted, and the secret police, known as the Tonton Macoute, terrorized the capital with extreme prejudice, using fear as a tool for control. If you were an enemy of Duvalier, they would torture and kill you without hesitation, further enshrining the cult personality around him. The nation was impoverished. People lived in daily horror, many residing in squalor, yet too fearful to express dissent, even in private. So pervasive was Papa Doc's police state in the city. Meanwhile, rampant corruption led Duvalier to embezzle state funds into his own and his confidants' pockets, creating an elite ruling class that divided the nation and the capital between those who had and those who had not. This inequality persists to this day. Even though the nation remains very, very poor, a select few control almost all the wealth. Now, Papa Doc died in 1971, but he was immediately replaced by his son, Jean-Claude Duvalier, known as Baby Doc. At only 19 years old, Baby Doc picked up where his father left off and remained in power until 1986, when unrest forced him to flee for Paris. He was eventually charged with corruption before he too passed away. Following his regime, attempts at democratization were made, but persistent instability, coups, rebellions, and institutions deliberately weakened by the Duvaliers inevitably allowed violence to return. The final blow to this flawed experiment came with the death of former President Jovenel Moïse, who was assassinated by armed goons in 2021, plunging the nation into a deep power struggle. Now, in 2025, the situation is as dire as ever. Gangs control up to 85% of the capital, and violence has spiraled completely out of control. The capital has effectively become a war zone, with police, military, and gangs all vying for dominance. But why am I telling you this? Well, Papa Doc came to power in 1957, meaning that only those older than 70 today remember a time when violence and fear did not define Port-au-Prince society. This generational trauma, combined with the other massive issues facing the capital, continues to fuel the relentless cycle of violence. We are nearing the bottom of the well. We are circling the drain. Moreover, this cycle manifests in the ways the state is run, through income inequality, a struggling economy, rampant corruption, and desperate people seeking any means to survive. Even though the Duvaliers are gone, many former Tonton Macoute members remain influential in the political turmoil that contributes to the death and destruction that we see today. Violence begets violence begets violence. People have been killed, they've been robbed, sexually assaulted, displaced, tortured, and subjected to even worse atrocities. The trauma among the civilian population is palpable. Some individuals attempt to flee, and while a few manage to reach other countries, closed airports make it far from simple. Many are left with no choice but to do what they can and endure their suffering. With gangs nearly in full control of the city, there is growing concern that they may soon seize control of the entire nation. If that happens, it could result in further massacres of innocent people, similar to what occurred in the extremely impoverished and densely populated commune of Cité Soleil in the city's metropolitan area. In early December of 2024, just last year, 207 innocent civilians were massacred by a gang in control of the area. Critical resources that could help provide relief, such as aid at hospitals, they're regularly targeted, and the media has experienced similar treatment. Nothing stops until the violence stops is both a symptom and a cause that drags the city and indeed the nation further away from achieving stability and rebuilding. Now, it's hardly surprising that gangs proliferate across the city, given that Haiti itself is gripped by desperate poverty. As the poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere, Haiti's hardships are nowhere more evident than in its capital, exemplified by Cité Soleil. Hundreds of thousands of people live well below the poverty line, while deep-seated corruption steadily undermines the nation's economy. In the city, only a few managed to do well. Those who once had the means have often already used their money to flee the instability. Resources are scarce across the board, even basic food is in short supply, leading to the emergence of the infamous mud cookies, which the most impoverished are forced to eat just to sustain themselves. What's more, there's no real formal economy in the city anymore. Sure, a handful of international corporations still operate near the airport and employ some people, but the majority of the city's livelihood comes from informal sectors, activities like shelling peanuts, cooking and selling handcrafts, or anything else people can get their hands on. It is incredibly hard to earn a living with gangs so rampant. These gangs are also there not only to steal, but to exploit what little people manage to make. What is someone to do when the gangs have guns and they do not? But again, it's always been this way, even going back to the days after the slave revolt in 1804. Haiti has been a poor country for centuries. But how can that be? We know it was once resource-rich, particularly with commodities like sugar from the slave trade, so how has it remained so poor since its liberation? Well, historically, nations that still practiced slavery feared potential revolts among their own enslaved populations, and they did everything possible to stop Haiti's development at all costs. France, for instance, levied a huge reparation bill on Haiti following its revolt. The nation was forced to take out enormous loans financed by French and American banks to pay the debt, a sum so large that Haiti did not finish repaying it until 1947. Meanwhile, during this period, other nations heavily embargoed the newly independent country, effectively stifling its development from ever really even getting started. Papa Doc came along and centralized much of the economy and power in the capital. This meant that if you wanted to forge a real future for yourself, you had to go there and submit to his horrific regime and the violence of the Tonton Macoute. With this centralization and endemic corruption, one can trace an almost 200-year historical through-line of economic exploitation of the Haitian people, even for those living in Port-au-Prince specifically. The nation's stunted development left its institutions weak and vulnerable to coups, rebellions, power seizures, and foreign interventions, all conditions that Papa Doc exploited when he rose to power. He then made the situation immeasurably worse. Even though the debt to France had been paid, he siphoned away the money that the nation desperately needed for growth to enrich himself and his friends. While other nation-states were emerging out of the colonial era for the first time, Haiti was being economically ransacked from within its own capital. With the nation never really given a chance to develop economically before violence returned, it became incredibly difficult for both the city and the nation to invest in public infrastructure, education, or anything that might elevate the next generation. And so the cycle repeats, and they remain poor. A proportion of people who lack development opportunities and have no way to earn money will obviously turn to crime to survive. And where is the most money? Port-au-Prince, of course, not because it's particularly wealthy by urban standards, but simply because it's just wealthier than the rest of the nation. However, this also means that people have flooded into the city over time, creating another issue. There just isn't enough infrastructure, cash, or jobs to go around, which leaves unemployment extremely high, even though 90% of formal Haitian investments and jobs are located there. There may have been enough opportunities once, but not anymore, and certainly not since the gang seized power. This in turn leads to more people turning to crime, which is what we meant when we said that the violence is both a symptom and a cause of the city's problems. International aid from outside the country, intended to provide economic relief, is frequently stolen or looted. The few remaining local political leaders and elites who are detached from the general populace either fail to disperse the aid properly or, much like Papa Doc before them, pocket it out of greed. After all, who knows when the next wad of cash is going to come? Instead of reaching the people, the money is more likely to be used for something extravagant, like a heated swimming pool. This situation creates further complications. While some view international aid as essential, others consider it a complete waste of time and money, resulting in a political quagmire. Meanwhile, the capital city does not receive its fair share of the much-needed aid for recovery. Despite the fact that $6 billion have been channeled into Haiti, the country is now worse off than ever. Corruption and intermediaries skim off the funds at every opportunity. As the saying goes, it's a kleptocracy. A fish rots from the head down. The city's infrastructure is extremely vulnerable. Not only is it susceptible to gang attacks, especially when valuable, but it is also informal in nature. Much of it is set up by desperate people trying to do something, anything, to gain a little relief and improve their lives. Therefore, it isn't uniform or subject to stringent safety standards. The port in the capital, along with the roads, healthcare facilities, and housing, is lacking and can't cope with the large population in the metropolitan area. As a result, shantytowns like Cité Soleil have sprung up all across the capital's metro area. And that infrastructure desperately needs that money. Most of you will remember that back in 2010, a massive 7-magnitude earthquake devastated the country, compounding its misery and destroying nearly everything in its path. Approximately 230,000 people were killed, 300,000 were injured, and another 1.5 million people were displaced. That's about 8% of the population. The country's infrastructure was left in ruins. At the time, it was estimated that Haiti needed over $11 billion to rebuild, a sum that it just didn't have. The widespread damage made it even harder for the government to manage the crisis, and the situation in Port-au-Prince was even more severe. Not only did the quake kill 1/3 of the nation's civil servants, leaving the government scrambling and under-equipped, but it also caused the partial or total collapse of key administrative buildings, including the National Palace, the Parliament, and all but one of its ministries. On top of that, the National Penitentiary was damaged, leading to thousands of prisoners escaping. Critical stretches of road, which would have allowed the government to deliver vital services and offer help to those in other parts of the country, were just completely destroyed. Furthermore, because the state infrastructure had been centralized thanks to Papa Doc, all of Haiti's governmental eggs were in one basket when the quake hit. You can see how the city's historical issues have compounded over time, further exacerbating key problems as the nation lumbers from crisis to crisis. Now look, a lot of effort went into getting the capital and the country functional again. However, Haiti was not in a strong position even before the earthquake, and it continues to struggle with recovery 15 years later, despite international efforts and UN-backed donors. In Port-au-Prince alone, there were 19 million cubic meters of rubble and debris. How is a country as poor and corrupt as Haiti ever going to clear that up? And, well, we'll let you know when it happens, because the Haitian people are still waiting. So as you can see from everything so far, Port-au-Prince has experienced the worst 15-year stretch of any city on Earth that hasn't been at war in recent memory. With the capital still unable to recover fully from the earthquake, compounded by rising gang activity, rampant poverty, and ongoing infrastructure problems, the health of its people has been affected in an enormously impactful way. Firstly, as we said earlier, trauma is palpable, and you'll probably not be surprised to learn that Haiti is currently undergoing a mental health crisis across its overall population due to drug trafficking, political unrest, gang violence, and paramilitarism. According to the WHO, chronic traumatic stress is significant and also affects people's physical health. Conditions such as stress, anxiety, and depression can have a cascading effect on blood pressure, substance misuse, heart problems, and more. A substantial portion of the population experiences major distress every single day, a situation that is likely even worse in the capital, where opportunities are sparse and violence reaches its worst. And it gets even more dangerous when we explore the physical health side even further. After the earthquake in 2010, a significant number of UN troops arrived in the country, doing their best to help rebuild the shattered nation. Later, following a large scandal, which the UN vehemently denied, it was discovered that Nepalese UN peacekeeping troops had contaminated the Artibonite River just north of the capital by leaking their feces into it. The river was crucial for everyday life. People washed clothes and dishes, obtained their drinking water, and children played there. The smell was so bad that Haitians en masse went upstream from the base to get their water. Unfortunately, it was too late, and there was a massive cholera outbreak. Cholera was once thought to be eradicated from their nation thanks to successful sanitation efforts. However, in one fell swoop, the nation, and especially the capital, where millions of people lived in densely packed conditions, was plunged into a new crisis. This time a public health disaster. Over the course of a 9-year span from 2010 to 2019, nearly 800,000 people contracted cholera nationwide, and more than 9,000 people died from it. This means a full 6% of Haitian citizens caught the disease. For reference, 860 Haitians died from COVID-19 and fewer than 35,000 people contracted it. Now, the UN was quick to blame the earthquake. While it undoubtedly damaged some water structure, leaking sewage into the river was always destined to be a greater factor. With the nation returning to chaos, the outbreak has re-emerged. In 2022 alone, 90,000 new cases were reported, and in the first 3 months of 2025, there were almost 1,000 new cases, along with 15 deaths. This has become the most severe cholera outbreak in any nation in modern history. Not to mention that the nation's health infrastructure has been pushed beyond breaking point. Between the destruction caused by the earthquake, pervasive violence, widespread poverty, and chronic underdevelopment, only 37% of healthcare facilities in Port-au-Prince are fully operational, even in the richest city in the country, the capital, where such services should be easiest to provide. Pediatric, neonatal, and nutritional units for children are severely overwhelmed, and many are located in areas controlled by armed groups. These facilities lack adequate resources, equipment, and medicine needed to provide life-saving treatment. According to the UN, the lack of security in the city has made it nearly impossible for vital medical supplies to reach 58,000 children suffering from severe malnutrition in the capital's metropolitan area. Other factors have greatly increased other forms of violence in the city, particularly sexual violence. Because gangs exercise such extensive control, many of their members have inflicted trauma that can last a lifetime. The situation has escalated to the point that Médecins Sans Frontières, the francophone arm of Doctors Without Borders, has established a sexual violence survivors clinic in the city. In 2024, MSF provided care to almost 4,500 victims, over double the nearly 1,800 cases in 2022. But these organizations are battling on the front lines every day just to provide people with the care and respect they need and deserve. Groups like MSF have been targeted with violence and threats, including multiple attacks on staff and vehicles, as well as allegations that patients have been killed, while other hospitals have been looted by gangs, and physicians, nurses, and humanitarian workers have been kidnapped. The situation escalated to the point where, in December of 2024, MSF had to provisionally suspend its operations across the entire country. They bravely returned in early 2025, though not fully, and since then the situation in the city has continued to deteriorate. The capital is essentially in total anarchy, with crises stacked upon crises, feeding into one another like a vicious cycle, a snake eating its own tail. So how does the city fix itself when everything is broken? So what does all of this mean for Port-au-Prince's future? Well, it's hard to say. It's difficult to envision the gangs relinquishing control over the majority of the capital's metropolitan areas they so firmly occupy, not least because doing so would require significant resources that Haiti simply does not have. Dislodging these criminal elements will demand a tremendous investment of money, a costly toll in blood, and a lengthy commitment of time. Furthermore, the rest of the nation is likely to falter in its recovery when the central seat of power is held by violent thugs. Even if a dramatic change could occur overnight, a scenario that seems almost magical to hope for, Port-au-Prince's recovery will still depend on an enormous effort, wide-ranging structural reforms, and substantial support from the international community. After all, the country is still grappling with the aftermath of an earthquake that struck 15 years ago, meaning that by anyone's calculations, this is far from a quick process. Step 1 is to take back the capital, but that's easier said than done. The gangs are ubiquitous, entrenched, and powerful. The next step is to reform the nation from top to bottom, from its institutions to its laws and everything in between. This thorough reform is likely the only way for Port-au-Prince to regain control over its country's future in a manner that sustains peace. Yet this change cannot be imposed from the outside. It has to be driven by the Haitian people, standing on the ruins of their capital city, making that change and pledging to build back better than before. From there, it will be about sharing opportunities across the rest of the country so that prosperity is not concentrated in one small area. Next, the focus will shift to infrastructure and the staggering sum needed to invest in roads, ports, schools, hospitals, and adequate housing. As the economy begins to grow, the nation will gradually regain its footing, but only if it avoids the pitfalls of international interference that might once again impede its progress. We live in a different era now, and maybe things will truly be different. It's important to get this message across. Haiti isn't failing, it's already failed. What we are witnessing now is societal collapse, the result of centuries of mismanagement, violence, racism, fear, weak institutions, greed, and a growing sense of apathy compounded by oversaturation from external sources. Kenya is the only country thus far to have sent a significant number of police officers to support the UN mission in quelling the violence in the capital. Even more officers were deployed in January 2025, yet for now, the gangs are still in control. However, just because Port-au-Prince has failed doesn't mean it's irreparable. Although the scars running deep across the nation may leave trauma for generations, the country can still be salvaged, and from that effort emerges a story of hope. The silver lining is that despite the capital city suffering some of the worst problems in the country, The first steps towards rebuilding are already in sight, and although challenging, they are achievable. Addressing the issues in Port-au-Prince can set off a cascade of solutions that spread throughout the rest of the country if carried out properly. Port-au-Prince is not only the catalyst for this recovery, it is the linchpin upon which the country's future depends. At present, elections are planned for 2026, the first to be held in many years, but it remains to be seen if they will take place given that violence still plagues the capital. However, if they do proceed, and if Port-au-Prince can reclaim even a small semblance of normalcy, it will serve as a promising sign for the rest of the country. For now, Port-au-Prince is a story of resilience. Bad things have occurred before, and yet the city endures. Residents continue to find ways to earn a living, to feed themselves, and to survive even during the toughest times. Doctors and nurses remain dedicated to treating patients while police officers persist in their determined street-by-street, house-by-house efforts. And amidst it all, the citizens hold on to the hope of a brighter future and a better tomorrow. Thank you for watching.